This is near the very beginning of the book. It's called The Open Door. 9 years after the turn of the new century, a young photographer stepped off a Pullman and onto a crowded passenger platform in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Edgar Cayce Jr. would normally have paused to greet acquaintances at the station or stopped to warm himself by the coal stove in the ticket office, but he had more pressing business on that cold, rainy night of March 9th. He pulled the collar up on his thin cotton jacket and ventured into the downpour to meet a waiting carriage. The driver, Lynn Evans, quickly ushered Cayce inside his cab. As chief ticket agent and superintendent at the Hopkinsville depot, he was the natural choice to be on the lookout for his sister's husband arriving on the northbound local from Guthrie, Kentucky. Knowing the urgency of Cayce's visit, Evans likely reached for the horse's reins the moment the tall, lanky photographer emerged from the cloud of steam billowing out from under the 82-ton locomotive. Framed in the yellow halo of light from the overhead oil lamps on East 9th, Cayce looked too young to be a church deacon or the owner of one of Kentucky's most respected photography studios. His shy, pensive smile and clean-shaven face gave him the youthful appearance of a college sophomore arriving home for the holidays. His tousled brown hair was cut short, accentuating his high forehead, deep-set blue-gray eyes, and receding chin. His large feet and hands seemed better suited to an awkward youth on the verge of manhood than a 32-year-old husband and father. A closer look at Cayce revealed the truth of his age and occupation. Having spent much of the last decade in a dark room, his complexion was pale and his fingers were stained brown from the chemicals in the developing baths. The acrid odor of those chemicals still clung to his clothes as Cayce knocked the mud from his high-top leather shoes and climbed into the carriage for the mile-and-a-quarter trip through Hopkinsville to the house they called the Hill. The journey was familiar territory for both men. Cayce had traveled it many times on foot and by bicycle during his courtship with Lynn's sister Gertrude, and though he now had the luxury of taking a horse and carriage, Cayce knew the unpaved streets of the city and its squat 2- and 3-story red brick buildings as intimately as he knew the darkroom in his photo studio in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Behind the teardrop spire on the train station, the downtown business district where Edgar had once clerked at the Hooper Brothers bookstore, and where Edgar's uncle Delbert owned an interest in the city's largest hardware store. To the east was the block-long tobacco planter's warehouse, which had been built by Edgar's great-uncle George, and which housed the crop that gave Hopkinsville and Greater Christian County the distinction of being the largest producer of pipe and chewing tobacco in the nation. Dick Holland's Opera House on Main had been where Edgar had seen his first motion picture, a Keystone comedy starring Mabel Normand. Beyond the clock tower and the fire station shone the lights of the Hotel Latham, where Edgar had photographed Theodore Roosevelt during his campaign for president. Lynn Evans drove the carriage east on 7th Street, passing the ivy-covered boys' dormitory at South Kentucky College on Belmont Hill. The grand Victorian homes bordering the road were lined with white picket fences and decked with gingerbread filigree and rich pastels of blue and green, and with intricately detailed copper weather vanes. The further Lynn took Edgar from the center of town, the less ornate the homes became. East 7th became the unpaved Russellville Road, with the massive wrought iron gates of the Western Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, Christian County's largest building, dominated the bleak landscape. From here, Lynn's carriage passed a few lonely stands of ash and elder trees, still shorn of leaves, and Russellville Road became 2 muddy lanes running between the rolling brown hills and still bare fields that produced Hopkinsville's wealth. The house they called the Hill sat on a high promontory, a few hundred feet within the city limits. It was a single-story, 4-bedroom home of classic antebellum design, painted gunmetal gray and dominated by 4 white Doric columns. The front of the house was graced by a large open veranda shaded by oak and maple trees. At the rear of the property, separated from the main house by a carriage walk and rose garden, were the kitchen, smokehouse, chicken coop, barn, and dog run. The many outbuildings, like the home itself, had been designed with meticulous attention to detail and layout. It was constructed out of the finest materials by Lynn and Gertrude's maternal grandfather, the much adored Samuel Salter, a respected civil engineer, unlicensed physician, and one of the county's leading building contractors. It had been the late Salter's dream that the hill would always be a safe haven for his family and their progeny. Toward this end, he had seen to it that the house and its adjoining orchard, vegetable and herb garden, and 10 acres of farmland were free of debt before his death. He had assembled an extensive library of technical and reference books, kept a full store of medical supplies in a large cedar chest in the dining room, and stored enough dried fruit and jam in the root cellar and ham and sausage in the smokehouse to feed a family of 8 for an entire year. It wasn't enough, however, that his children be materially independent. In the spirit of Franklin and Jefferson, he desired all 5 of his children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, to become free thinkers. To that end, he had sent them to college where they studied Plato and Shakespeare, in addition to developing the skills and tools necessary to maintain the hill into the next century. His children were urged to read newspapers, attend rallies, and engage in intellectual discussion. Their opinion counted, no matter what political or social cause they chose to support. To Edgar Cayce, who had been born in a tiny frame cottage on a remote Christian county farm, who had ended his formal education in a single-room schoolhouse, and whose mother and sisters didn't dare to express an opinion of their own, the hill held an attraction that went beyond his love for Gertrude and his affection for Lynn Evans. The hill was a hothouse environment that stimulated his intellect and challenged his deeply felt notions of religion and spirituality. At the hill, Cayce didn't feel the need to confine his creative interests to the dark room or adopt a set of arcane rules practiced and preached by the church elders. He could freely explore that part of himself that he kept secret from his pastor and from his clients at the photo studio. Here at the hill, he was free, as Lynn liked to say, to experiment. As Lynn's carriage approached the main entrance, Edgar felt again the familiar sense of security that accompanied all of his trips to the hill. Lynn brought the horse to a halt, and as he tended to the carriage, Cayce walked quickly up the muddy path to the veranda, where he was greeted by Hugh Evans, Lynn's older brother. They briefly exchanged pleasantries before coming into the parlor where the rest of the family was gathered around the fireplace. Gertrude and Lynn's mother, Kate, was there, along with their Aunt Elizabeth and her son Hiram, their Aunt Carrie, her husband, and Dr. Thomas House, and their infant son, Thomas House Jr. Nothing appeared unusual about the small circle of family members gathered around the hearth. They could have been a typical upper-middle-class Victorian family engaged in one of the quaint parlor games popular at the time, where participants huddled together to listen to a story or solve a riddle. This was no game, however. Their attention was focused on tiny Thomas House Jr., who lay on a small white embroidered pillow on his mother's lap. The infant had been suffering convulsions since his premature birth 3 months earlier. The convulsions had become so frequent that they now occurred every 20 minutes, almost to the second, leaving the helpless child too weak to nurse from his mother's breast or wrap his tiny hands around her fingers. Tommy House was literally dying from malnutrition and lack of sleep, a diagnosis that was confirmed by the child's father, a physician, and the family's 2 personal physicians, Dr. Jackson, a general practitioner from Hopkinsville, and Dr. Haggard, a pediatric specialist from Nashville, who had been attending the child since birth. Although the 3 doctors disagreed about what treatment they should provide, all agreed that Thomas House Jr. had little or no chance of living through the night. They were now turning to Edgar Cayce, a photographer with an 8th grade education, no medical training, to try and save little Tommy's life. Carrie, the child's mother, wasn't sure he could help any more than Edgar himself could be sure. But she wanted him to try. In previous experiments, Edgar had demonstrated to her a remarkable ability to put himself into a hypnotic trance and obtain psychic information that she believed was beyond the grasp of ordinary people. Edgar's experiments at the Hill had been more successful than anyone had ever imagined. Even as a child, Edgar had only to close his eyes to tell the location of a lost ring or a pocket watch. He could read a deck of playing cards that were face down on a table and recite the contents of a closed book or sealed envelope. By merely thinking about someone, he could wake them up from a deep sleep, induce them to make a telephone call or write a letter, or in the case of young children, hold them in a particular pose long enough to have their portraits taken. He had solved a murder, located missing persons, diagnosed illness and disease, and recommended cures. He didn't use a crystal ball, playing cards, or a Ouija board, nor did he belong to a temple or arcane spiritual fraternity, abstain from certain foods, tobacco or liquor, recite incantations, or burn incense. He needed only to close his eyes, and as if putting himself to sleep, and after a short period of quiet and meditation, to be asked for help by a person who genuinely needed and wanted that help. The greater a person's need or more elevated their motivation, the more astonishing the results appeared to be. The mere arrival of Cayce at the Hill was enough to provoke Dr. Haggard to pack his bags and leave. Like many doctors in Hopkinsville and Nashville, he had heard accounts of what Cayce was alleged to have done or told people, and wanted no part of what he referred to as trickery. Dr. Jackson unabashedly shared his colleague's skepticism, but as the family's long-term physician, he had seen Cayce do things that he could not readily explain. Dr. House was also skeptical, but like Jackson, knew Cayce and his family too intimately to believe that trickery was involved. The Cayces were simple tobacco farmers from the rural hamlet of Beverly, and Edgar was the least educated and unassuming of the lot. House had reluctantly agreed to call Edgar to the Hill only because Carrie, his headstrong wife, with whom he was very deeply in love, had insisted that he be consulted. Doctors House and Jackson accompanied Edgar from the parlor into the master bedroom across the hall. Inside, Edgar took off his jacket and shoes, removed his tie and collar, and laid down on the embroidered linen bedspread on the overstuffed mattress on the large oak bed. He pulled a down comforter over his stocking feet, adjusted himself on his back, and then, feet together, hands across his solar plexus, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. House took a seat in a rocking chair beside the bed. Jackson stood by the fireplace. More than a minute passed. In silence only broken by the rain pounding on the roof and the weak cries of the dying child in the next room, Edgar's breathing deepened and his eyes closed. "You have before you the body of Thomas House, Jr. of Hopkinsville, Kentucky," Dr. House said. "Diagnose his illness and recommend a cure." By all appearances, Edgar looked to be fast asleep. His arms remained crossed over his chest, his legs straight, eyes closed, and his breathing slow. Dr. House knew better. He had once seen the young photographer go into a trance so deep that fellow physicians thought he was in a coma. Edgar hadn't even flinched when one of House's colleagues had jabbed the blade of a knife under one of Edgar's fingernails, and another had stuck a hypodermic needle into his foot. And yet, the sleeping Cayce could answer questions as if he were wide awake. Cayce began to speak in his normal voice, a deep, rich baritone with a distinctly southern accent. The only difference that House could observe between Cayce's voice in the sleeping or trance state and his voice in the waking state was that he spoke faster and with greater assurance, using language that most people believed was ordinarily beyond his grasp. At first, his words were garbled, almost a hum, and then, like a phonograph needle that has found the right groove on a record, his voice cleared and his words became well modulated and easy to understand. Yes, we have the body and mind of Thomas House Jr. here, Cayce finally said. Cayce proceeded to report the infant's temperature, blood pressure, and other physical and anatomical details and body organs. He described the child's condition in such a cool, calm, and detached manner that an observer would have been left with the impression that he was a physician describing to fellow colleagues an examination he was in the process of conducting. In this case, however, the physician had his eyes closed and the patient was cradled in his mother's arms in the next room. Cayce appeared to have the ability to see right into his patient's body, to examine each organ, blood vessel, and artery with microscopic precision. In the case of Thomas House Jr., Cayce described an epileptic condition that had resulted in severe infantile spasms, nausea, and vomiting, evidently the outcome of the child's premature birth, which in turn had been a result of his mother's poor physical condition during the early months of her pregnancy. Cayce prescribed a measured dose of belladonna to be followed by a poultice made from the bark of a peach tree. Cayce ended the trance session himself when he stated, "We are through for the present." House then instructed the sleeping Cayce to regain consciousness. Cayce dutifully followed instructions and awoke, only to find himself alone in the bedroom. In the 2 or 3 minutes it had taken him to open his eyes and stretch his arms, the two doctors, deep in discussion and agitated by what he had said, had left the room and returned to the parlor. As unbelievable as the source of the information was, House and Jackson both agreed that the diagnosis sounded perfectly reasonable. It was the recommended cure that upset them. For the sleeping, Cayce had prescribed an unusually high dose of a toxic form of deadly nightshade. Even if the peach tree poultice could somehow leach the poison out of the infant's system, administering that large a dose of belladonna to a child as small and as weak as Thomas House Jr. was tantamount to murder. Jackson expressed his sentiments in no uncertain terms to his colleague and then to Carrie, the child's mother. "You'll kill little Tommy for sure," he told her. Tommy's father had no choice but to agree. Homeopathic belladonna had sometimes been used to treat lung and kidney ailments, but pure belladonna, in the form Cayce recommended, was only used in topical ointments and was certainly not something to spoon into the mouth of a 3-month-old child. Edgar joined the two doctors in the parlor, but couldn't contribute to the discussion taking place. He was never able to remember anything he had said or heard when in a trance state, and in his waking state had little more than a rudimentary knowledge of medicine or the medical profession. However, Edgar had heard enough about what the doctors had told Carrie to be concerned, for although he had used his alleged psychic powers to diagnose medical problems before, he had never used it in a way that he believed would endanger a life. Certainly not that of a child who was powerless to determine his own fate. Until now, he had only been experimenting to see if he could help the people who came to him. He now had to face the grim reality that something he said in a trance could result in a death in the family. It was the child's mother who made the decision to administer the drug. Having seen Edgar work miracles in his sleep, she believed that he had been touched by the divine, that a heavenly spirit spoke through and in him when he was in a trance. In previous experiments, she had been advised not to undergo abdominal surgery, as recommended by her doctors, which indeed turned out to be unnecessary. Edgar in trance had also predicted that she would become pregnant, something that her husband and 2 specialists had said was physically impossible. He had also given her the date that she would give birth and said that she would deliver a boy. And the spiritual message that had accompanied this information, that God's love and forgiveness must be foremost in her heart, had inspired her to minister to the sick and infirm in the Hopkinsville asylum. Now, she believed, God's mercy and love was reaching out to her. If Edgar Cayce said that she had to poison her son in order to save his life, then that was what she was going to do. Dr. House could not make the same leap of faith. As a highly respected general practitioner with aspirations to become county health commissioner, everything he had seen and heard in the bedroom ran contrary to his training, experience, and common sense. Although he was aware of the experiments at the Hill, he hadn't condoned them, nor given them much credence. He had permitted his wife to participate because she derived such pleasure and comfort from them. He had looked upon Edgar's activities as entertainment, a mere parlor game, not unlike the stage performances at Holland's Opera House, in which the songbirds were produced from top hats, or hypnotists read the minds of participants chosen from the audience. But what he had just seen and heard in the bedroom a few moments earlier terrified him. Cayce hadn't spoken in vague, uncertain terms that were open for interpretation or could be intuited by a reasonably educated person. Without physically examining Tommy, Cayce had given the child's blood pressure and temperature, which House knew to be correct because he and Jackson had taken the vital signs only a few minutes before Edgar's arrival at the Hill. Cayce had also described body organs with the detail and expertise of a skilled surgeon conducting an autopsy. Cayce didn't dare let himself speculate, House didn't dare let himself speculate why the sleeping Cayce had used the plural form we when conducting his trance examination, or why he apparently needed to contact little Thomas's mind as well as his body before the examination could proceed. At his wife's insistence, and despite his very great and obvious reservations, House ultimately agreed to prepare the belladonna. He justified his decision by saying that his son would surely be dead if nothing was done. He and Dr. Jackson might be able to prolong the infant's life by a few hours, but they were powerless to keep him alive through the night. At the very worst, giving little Tommy belladonna would put the child out of his misery. House dissolved the white powder into a spoonful of water. Carrie forced the child to swallow it. Cayce didn't stay to watch because he couldn't stand the thought of seeing the child die in his mother's arms. He and Lynn Evans went outside to collect the ingredients for the poultice, which had been recommended in the treatment. By the light of an oil lamp, Cayce climbed the top of a peach tree in the orchard behind the barn. Using a penknife, he skillfully cut the bark from around the youngest shoots he could reach and then handed them down to Lynn Evans. They took the bark into the kitchen at the rear of the house where Aunt Kate had put on a kettle on the stove to boil. Medical records do not exist to describe the child's physiological reaction to the belladonna or to the steaming hot towels dipped in peach tree solution in which the child was immediately wrapped. All that is known is that the crying stopped as soon as the mother spooned the poison into her child's mouth, and that he fell into the first deep and uninterrupted sleep that he had had since birth. Thomas House Jr. awoke hours later, drenched in sweat, cheeks pink, and breathing steadily. He was never to have a convulsion again. No one at the Hill that night knew who or what force had intervened to save the child's life. They only knew that their lives, like that of little Tommy House, had been irrevocably changed as a result. There was no turning back. The tears in their eyes and the pounding in their hearts told them that what they had experienced could neither be ignored or denied. Edgar Cayce had saved the child's life. Dr. House had witnessed something that would make it impossible for him to return to the medical profession as he knew it. He would later close his practice and devote the remainder of his career to operating a hospital in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which would be devoted to Edgar Cayce and his healing arts. Dr. House's wife, Carrie, would become that hospital's supervising nurse and a devoted and outspoken proponent of the man to whom the hospital was dedicated. Thomas House Jr. would grow into adulthood to build and to design innovative medical technology based on the Edgar Cayce readings. And at great personal expense and effort would frequently drive hundreds of miles to bring that technology to patients unable to come to Virginia Beach. Edgar himself had undergone a change. He had once again proven to himself the good that could come by using his special talents. He had taken one of the first apprehensive and faltering steps away from the refuge of his dark room and a step closer to the moment he would, as he said, step out into the light and turn himself over to what became known simply as the work. In the months and years to come, thousands of others would participate in the work. Edgar's wife, Gertrude, would eventually devote her life to conducting the trance readings and to protecting her husband from the many who sought to use and exploit him for financial gain. Gladys Davis, an Alabama stenographer and secretary, would become an instrumental part of the work, making verbatim transcripts of everything Cayce said while in trance. She would ultimately transcribe more than 35,000 pages of trance readings, thus creating the richest and most voluminous body of information that has ever existed on a psychic. For Gladys Davis and countless others who participated in the work that began in Kentucky and ended in Virginia Beach, it wasn't just the good that came as a result of the trance readings that endeared them to the work and inspired unqualified devotion to the man. As a photographer, church deacon, husband, and parent, Edgar Cayce may at times have strayed from the high ideals he set for himself. But he, a deeply religious man, humbly practiced what he preached and invariably put the needs of others before himself. He gave without thought of reward or acclaim. Doctors seeking to serve their patients' best interests by exposing Cayce as a charlatan and a fraud became his most visible converts. Among those physicians who studied Cayce were Hugo Munsterberg and William McDougall, deans at Harvard Medical School. Another was Dr. Gardner Murphy, a department chair at Columbia University. The more knowledgeable the doctors testing Cayce, the more he astonished them with his insights into the relationship and functioning of bodily organs and his then radical approach of treating the head as well as the heart. His sensational and successful treatments for everything from breast cancer to arthritis, hair loss, and psoriasis spawned entire industries dedicated to disease prevention and alternative medicine. 50 years before DNA testing, he startled a team of doctors by announcing that the day would come when physicians could learn everything they needed to about a patient from one drop of blood. In documents which have never been examined since Edgar Cayce's death, it is clear that even master magician Harry Houdini, having dedicated himself to exposing the fraudulent practices of more than 200 self-proclaimed mediums and the immensely popular occult spiritualists that captured the imagination of turn-of-the-century America and Europe, was unable to explain the Cayce phenomena. Like Houdini, who witnessed a trance reading at New York's McAlpin Hotel, police and FBI agents who later launched their own investigation could do little more than raise perplexing questions as to how Edgar Cayce was able to accomplish the seemingly impossible. The fact that Cayce didn't charge admission to witness his trance readings, that he didn't conjure ectoplasm or summon phantom spirits in a darkened room, presented unique and entirely unfamiliar challenges. Novelist and psychic researcher Arthur Conan Doyle described Cayce as being in a class all his own. He was not a Kentucky-born version of Russian émigré Madame Blavatsky or self-styled Eastern European guru like Gurdjieff, but shared a far greater affinity to Rudolf Steiner, the celebrated Austrian scientist, educator, and Christian mystic. Like Steiner's theories, Edgar Cayce's provocative trance-induced insights into physics and physical phenomena supported the basic tenets of modern science and embraced both Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity and Charles Darwin's concept of human evolution. Also, like Steiner, the spiritual philosophy which came through in the readings was distinctly Christian in origin and content. Although not always theologically correct, according to fundamentalist or Roman Catholic doctrines, it evoked much the same message of love, the fatherhood of God, and the brotherhood of man as that of the evangelist Cayce studied, knew, and admired, among them Dwight Moody, George Pentecost, Mordecai Ham, whose spiritual revivals later fired the imagination of the young Billy Graham. Prominent members of the New York Stock Exchange eventually would join the work, setting up special investment funds directed by trance information that would support the building of the Cayce Hospital and the establishment of the first and only known university whose faculty underwent psychic testing before being hired. Today, Atlantic University in Virginia Beach is the only fully accredited graduate school in the world that is entirely devoted to psychic and transpersonal studies. A young Connecticut writer who had set out to debunk Cayce would become his first biographer and most outspoken supporter. Edgar Cayce in trance would not only help this author choose the subject matter for his first 2 books, but provided a detailed accounting of exactly how many volumes they would sell. A graduate divinity student from the University of Chicago would become Edgar's personal secretary and would eventually go on to champion Edgar in print and from the pulpit, describing his mentor as a modern-day prophet in the tradition of Moses and Abraham. Books devoted solely to Cayce's prophecies have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Hugh Lynn Cayce, the eldest son of the sleeping prophet, would ultimately do more to promote the work and spread its message than anyone else. Yet he, like a myriad of other journalists and researchers who studied and dissected the Cayce trance readings in their entirety, came to the conclusion that his father wasn't always right. Edgar Cayce did make mistakes. However, the psychic's accuracy in the vast majority of cases made his few mistakes as fascinating a subject of study and speculation as the documented record of his miraculous successes. Cayce's apparent inconsistencies, among them his failure to help investigators locate the kidnapped child of Charles Lindbergh and the missing aviatrix Amelia Earhart, and his highly controversial commentaries on Egypt, Atlantis, and life on other planets, have challenged and mystified his most devoted students. In hundreds of pages of sensational documents that have never before been made public, it is now clear that such luminaries as Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and had trance readings by Cayce, as did engineers at RCA, IBM, Delco, and the president and founder of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Inventor Mitchell Hastings credited Cayce with helping him to develop FM radio. NBC founder David Sarnoff and his family secretly had readings. Remarkable technological and electronic designs provided by Cayce in trance are now used at almost every large hospital and airport in the world. And yet, the vast majority of his blueprints for inventions have never been produced or made public, including plans for a frictionless engine and an optical device purported to allow a normal person to see human auras. Unbeknownst to their many fans, Helen Keller, Gloria Swanson, George Gershwin all privately requested and received Cayce's help. Psychic readings were conducted for the concerned mother of Ernest Hemingway, who consulted Cayce about her son's writing career. Marilyn Monroe practiced beauty aids that Cayce recommended in trance readings. Business leader Nelson Rockefeller and labor organizer George Meany, without the knowledge of their associates, availed themselves of Cayce's medical advice. Carl Laemmle of Universal Studios Harry Gertz of Paramount Pictures and legendary film pioneer Thomas Ince studied screenplays which were dictated during trance sessions. Parker Brothers markets a card game, The Pit, that is still popular 97 years after Cayce developed it. High-ranking foreign diplomats and church leaders consulted him, as did government agents who sought and obtained private trance sessions, which they themselves conducted and transcribed. Cayce's trance discourses on reincarnation, holistic medicine, and the international brotherhood of man became an inspiration to such diverse fans as Elvis Presley, John Lennon, Ram Dass, Shirley MacLaine. And although the details remain hidden, circumstantial evidence suggests that Cayce conducted psychic readings for the 28th President of the United States, then seeking to make peace in the aftermath of the war to end all wars. Ironically, standard medical practitioners and fundamentalist Christians, the two groups for whom Cayce directed his most cogent and detailed trance counsel, were those who most vehemently sought to discredit or dismiss him. Although he himself, both awake and in trance, was an ardent and devout Christian, it was Jews who built the institutions dedicated to his name and who first embraced his message. To the army of disciples who would turn to Cayce for help and advice, there was no question of the truth of Cayce's psychic powers. His trance readings, they came to believe, held answers to life's most important questions, the purpose of our existence on earth and what to expect after death. He provided trance commentary on Jesus and his disciples, the role of women in the founding of Christianity, the secret of the Sphinx, the healing powers of crystals, and the design of the universe. He offered remarkable insights into how to improve relations between men and women, the spiritual role that parents play in choosing the child that will be born to them, and the possible causes of homosexuality. He accurately predicted the failure of prohibition, the beginning and the end of World War II, the deaths of Franklin Roosevelt and President John Kennedy, and made startling assertions about the next millennium and the second coming of Christ. Edgar Cayce's study groups now exist in almost every country in the world, with a total membership well in the tens of thousands. The Cayce Archives and Study Center in Virginia Beach provides unrestricted access to more than 150,000 pages of trance readings and commentary. Many of those who have studied this material and made the pilgrimage to Virginia Beach have put his prescription for a better life into practice. They believe Cayce to be the quintessential Christian mystic, the conduit of a divine message that transcended the life and times of the young Kentucky photographer and heralded the birth of the New Age movement. As his son, Hugh Lynn Cayce, would say, Edgar was like an open door into another dimension. People were attracted to the light. The miracle cure in Hopkinsville that rainy March evening was clearly a turning point for Edgar Cayce and the work that would become his life. Little more than a quarter of a century earlier, the unexpected death of Tom Cayce, Edgar's paternal grandfather and childhood friend, marked an earlier turning point. If indeed Edgar was an open door, then Tom Cayce was the first to step through it. So anyway. Thank you. Come on. Well, anyway, so that's the start, and we know what happens with TJ, because he starts appearing in the barn, and then all the problems start. What do you do with a child that sees his dead grandfather?